Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on U.S. policy on Israel in an election year. And today we will discuss the future of U.S.-Israeli relations, especially after October 7th, and what could the implication of this relation be on the U.S. elections, and of course, a little bit on Israeli domestic politics. And we have three distinguished panelists today: Daniel Levy, Lara Friedman, and Kadir Üstün. Their bios are attached on our post. So I will just, we have 1 hour, so I will just skip the set of questions. In the meantime, if you have questions, if you are on Zoom, you can write it to the chat box or Q&A box. Or if you are following us on YouTube or Twitter, please comment your questions so that my assistants can collect the questions and I can direct to our panelists. Let's start with the UN Security Council voting last week, and actually on Monday. What could be the impact of this decision of the US to abstain this time instead of veto to US-Israeli relations? Lara, shall we start with you?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and thank you so much for having us today. I'm not sure where other people fall on this. I think in terms of, looking at as you say, the impact on U.S. relations of the abstention. Look, it's a political hot potato. In some ways, this was a win-win for Netanyahu. If we vetoed, it means the U.S. is very much in the service of the Israeli government, and if we abstain, it meant he had a political weapon to use with supporters in Congress, with supporters in the US, and against the Biden administration. I think it's worth reminding people the UN, how the US votes the UN became a real issue starting in the Obama era. When President Obama was first elected, a narrative surfaced, a consensus narrative that never in the history of US-Israel relations had any president voted against Israel at the UN Security Council. And as people may recall, at the very end of the Obama administration, President Obama abstained on a UN Security Council resolution that really broke no new ground on things that had been longstanding US policy, but it was claimed to be a historic betrayal of the US-Israel relationship. The fact is, and I wrote this at the time in a New York Times op-ed, and I published all my data, that prior to the Obama administration, every US administration from both parties had at times, usually multiple times, voted against Israel at the UN Security Council, either abstained or actually voted in favor of resolutions that Israel didn't like. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you play the political game, the narrative that there is zero daylight between the U.S. and Israel in the Security Council is once again once again the narrative, and framing the U.S. abstention as a betrayal. We've seen language out of Israelis that Biden has abandoned Israel, which is just surreal considering how much political capital he's spending in the international community defending Israel from any consequences for its actions, in taking, continuing to send weapons, protecting Israel from U.S. law, where it's violating U.S. law in terms of humanitarian aid, all of that. And on top of that, and here's where I'll end, and maybe someone else can talk about this more, the fact is that the Biden administration decided it was going to take the sting out of its abstention immediately by declaring a UN Security Council resolution non-binding, which of course isn't true. UN Security Councils are binding. That is the entire weight of UN Security Council action. They're not enforceable unless an additional step is taken, but they are binding. And the U.S. in its effort to say, Israel, don't be mad at us because we took the step of abstaining because we didn't want to further enrage our allies in the international community, or we wanted to have give some pressure valve for domestic opinion. Don't worry. In order to protect you from this, so you won't feel so bad, we're literally going to undermine the entire international legal basis of work for the UN Security Council. I mean, looking at what the impact is on U.S.-Israel relations, I mean, I think we're going to keep hearing about this, and it'll be a tune that is played over and over in this election season by opponents of Biden, and I think it has much broader ramifications down the road for UN action anywhere.
I will go to Daniel, but before that, Lara, the resolution is about Ramadan, to have a ceasefire in Ramadan. Do you see any potential future resolutions after Ramadan? Because it's only 2 weeks left in Ramadan right now. Do you expect another resolution about the future?
I mean, there could be. The U.S. position, I heard one of the spokespeople yesterday saying, well, we've passed a resolution. Quit bugging us to support a resolution. We obviously can work together, and we passed a resolution. I mean, as long as this continues, and depending what happens in Rafah, I think all of us probably expect things to get much, much worse. I think it's quite likely there will be efforts to bring additional resolutions for ceasefire. And as long as the Israeli position and the U.S. position is in support of a temporary ceasefire that is predicated on the agreement that Israel can then, after the ceasefire, go back and continue going after Hamas and wreaking misery across Gaza, I think it's unlikely we'll have a ceasefire before then. So I think it's certainly possible, if not very likely, that we'll see more of these.
Daniel, the same questions about the UN Security Council resolution and its impact to US-Israeli relations.
Yeah, I fully agree with Lara, and the place where I pick up is what Lara pointed out, which is to the extent to which, when it comes to US Israel and the situation in Gaza, to the extent to which this could have sent a signal that Netanyahu's time is running out, leverage is going to be deployed belatedly by the Biden administration. They did everything to water that down and to reassure, keep killing. Don't think for one moment that we now care about Palestinian civilian life. You've got this right all along. We do not care. Keep killing. And I think that message was sent in the remarkable words. I don't know whether the ambassador to the UN of the US, Greenfield Thomas, will be a very minor footnote in this whole story, or whether her frequent appalling interventions will, in history, get greater attention than that. But it's quite remarkable that she, as Lara said, used the word non-binding. There is no such thing. The International Court of Justice clarified that in 1971 in terms of this being non-binding. But it was an important moment because they said the quiet part out loud. When it comes to Israel's behavior, when it comes to the treatment of Palestinians, there is no such thing as binding international law. Everything in international law is non-binding. That is the American position, as elaborated on at the International Court of Justice, when the court just a few weeks ago was conducting its hearings on the advisory opinion requested by the UN General Assembly with regard to the legal obligations, including for third parties, and consequences of the prolonged occupation. So here we have it. No attempt to dress this up. The emperor is naked. There is no such thing in American eyes as binding international law when it comes to the treatment and the absence of rights for Palestinians. So I think a few things were going on here. The most salient in terms of the trajectory of developments in Gaza and how much longer and more appalling this could possibly get is that the US sent the signal, non-binding, carry on. The US-Israel bilateral track, including, which we may come to, this question of how you do Rafah, not whether you do Rafah. That is where things will be decided, not at the UN. I think there were a couple of other things going on, which I will just touch on briefly. I tend to think that this was, yes, designed to send some kind of domestic political signal in the US. I think the Biden administration is quite happy with the headlines with regard to a fallout with Netanyahu. I tend to think that politicians exaggerate the stupidity they attribute to their voters, to their electors. And I think whether it's in Michigan or elsewhere, people can largely see through this nonsense and are not going to give the administration credit where it is not merited. I think there was also something of a signal in the international arena. Look, we're not going to take a hit for vetoing yet another resolution. However, I think in that respect, what this has done to the standing of the US, which wasn't great anyway, but we did just experience 2 years of America trying to claim that it is the upholder of the rule of law and preaching and getting on its moral soapbox and finger wagging at everyone, and especially at the global South, get on board with us vis-a-vis Ukraine. That's done. No, they don't even try and make that argument, let's be honest, anymore. And finally, I would note that this abstention, of course, came off the back of the resolution that the US had put forward on the Friday that was vetoed by Russia, by China, and was opposed by Algeria. The important thing to acknowledge here is that Algeria is the representative of the Arab League on the Security Council. Algeria was not acting in a simple nation-state capacity. It was acting and voting as the consensus position, including of the Palestinians and the Arab League. And should anyone be fooled by the ridiculous headlines that accompanied the American resolution that suggested this was America shifting to a ceasefire position, go read the resolution. It was weaker. It was much longer, by the way. It was weaker than the resolution they abstained on. And what the US tried to do was shoehorn all kinds of American policy positions into this resolution. It was a terrible resolution. I actually heard the French ambassador, they had voted in favor, right? I heard him speak straight after the vote on the media saying there were lots of problems. The stuff on ceasefire wasn't strong enough. The stuff on Rafah wasn't strong enough, but we voted in favor anyway. And the person who I think captured this motion perfectly was the country that abstained, that is a current elected member of the Security Council, Guyana, whose ambassador, I'm paraphrasing here, in the debate said, the problem with this resolution is if you read the resolution and you hadn't been following this, you would think there was this one party, Hamas, doing these dreadful things, and then something else was going on, but you're not at all sure why or who was doing it, because not once in this American resolution do they actually attribute any blame or criticism or responsibility to the Israeli party for what it has done in Gaza.
Daniel, before going to Kadir, there is a question, just I want to make it interactive, and there's an audience question. Michael Kursik is asking, we see that as the war continues, Hamas is still viable. Why is there no UN pressure on Hamas to surrender, to end the slaughter? Obviously, Hamas has no interest in saving Palestinian lives, but it could end it all now.
I think that the correct response to that question is to kind of say, listen, if you want to go there, then Israel could end this right now if it withdrew the entirety of the occupation, which it is legally obligated to do, by the way. So let's not go off on fantasy journeys. If you want quick fix solution, Israel, withdraw the entirety of your occupation. Some will say, but Hamas wants to wipe out river to the sea. There's only one person who regularly talks the language of the river to the sea, and he happens to sit in the Israeli Prime Minister's office. But Hamas, under those circumstances, by the way, for much less, Hamas will end this. I find the idea that there is not pressure on Hamas and that the UN could put more pressure on Hamas than 6 months of Israeli bombing a curious idea. Let's put it like that. Israel, the conditions on the battlefield are that Israel is not ready to concede. Hamas is not ready to concede. Hence, there will either be a deal which ultimately is acceptable to both parties, and there will be pressure on both parties, or this will continue. I would suggest that the reality we see is that in the negotiations, there is not an effort, especially by the American side, to reach a position that could lead to a permanent ceasefire. and that is shameful.
Thank you, Daniel. Kadir, same question about your perspective about the UN Security Council resolution.
Thank you. I just have to agree with much of what both Lara and Daniel said. Just to take a step back and how we got here, of course, this UN abstention by the United States has arrived after several vetoes. And then, 6 months by now, the damage is so much that, on the ground that, I don't know what it could do anyway, even if it was, even if the US said this is a binding resolution. Because like Lara said, if there's no enforcement mechanism, these things don't work. And Israel has defied so many of them in the past that, it doesn't do much on the ground. But what it does is, in terms of international legitimacy, whatever that means, right? For the United States especially, that has to do with that. And of course, I think the elections in Michigan and Minnesota, other places, the reaction from within the Democratic Party did play a role in Biden's kind of adjustment of position. It's not a change of policy. It's like Daniel said, essentially amounting to saying you can keep killing, just do it, slowly in a different way, etc. And the US is still supplying arms and weapons to Israel. The conditioning it on humanitarian, human rights issues has become controversial, right? This shouldn't have been controversial at all. So, but what it is doing, this episode is doing to the United States international legitimacy, is it's going to have a lasting impact, I think, because, just within a year, what the United States defended in terms of rules-based, international order when it came to Ukraine, and then essentially flipping within a year when it came to Israel. This has not missed any audiences, international audiences. And that does damage to the United States kind of claim to leadership in the international arena. And not to mention, of course, the double standards and all of that. But it makes any kind of US policy implementation, you can disagree with it, but much more harder, right? The US policy is, White House is undermining its own policy so much. As soon as it's abstaining from a vote, it's saying, oh, it's not that bad. They watered it down. Instead of permanent ceasefire, they said it should be a lasting ceasefire, etc. Not only that they watered it down, but they also apologized for it and then, try to make up for it. So it doesn't amount to a policy change, but it makes its own, policy of supporting Israel, right? Against Netanyahu, right? You're supporting Israel, but you're kind of trying to isolate Netanyahu. If that is the new policy, I think it undermines that as well. So this kind of muddling through, making some, statements in the, that don't amount to much in the name of kind of shifting the pressure away from the White House, it's just not going to help. And this is what we've seen in this UN vote. So Israel has, right, the Israelis, Netanyahu government, I should say, declared from the first day what they intended to do. And they're not giving up on this. And the US has been complicit in this, enabling in this whole episode. And imagine this: Democratic voters, the young people demonstrating, they have used the term Genocide Joe so many times. So this is not something that President Biden can get rid of by, engineering these kind of crafty ways of international maneuvering at the UN. So he's going to have to do, you know, the only way is to change policy. That's not happening. And I don't think the UN vote is a sign of change of policy on the part of the US. It's just a sign of how difficult the White House feels the pressure from the ground, I guess, from the Democratic Party, the young people, and the Arab American voters in an election year. So unfortunately, that's the situation.
Thank you, Kadir. And Lara, what do you think? Let's go beyond the UN Security Council decision. And what do you think the cost of this unconditional support of the US will be to Biden administration domestically in an election year and US foreign policy, both in the region and globally? I know you and Daniel mentioned this a little bit, but let's go over that one by one. Let's start with the domestic politics. What will be the consequence of this action, do you think, for Biden administration?
So, I mean, we're all putting, getting out the crystal balls, right? Trying to guess. Look, whether this is not a partisan analysis. Looking at the results in the primaries, where the uncommitted numbers far outstripped anything I think that the Biden administration folks imagined. They can try to downplay it, but the numbers are striking. Maybe their analysis is that by the time we get to an election, it's a choice between Biden and Trump. Those Democratic voters will decide to still vote for Biden. It's possible they will. That's, my impression talking to a lot of people is that they won't. There's beyond that, there's generally when a presidential campaign, whether it's Trump or Biden, is seeking to energize its base and get out the vote and have people knock on doors and energize grassroots fundraising. I mean, that's certainly going to be, I'm on all the lists for both Trump and Biden. I see, tons of stuff every day. It's clear that, both campaigns are trying to do that. That's what you do in a campaign. It's listening to the grassroots progressive Dems who were, played a strong role in Biden's victory in the last election. I think probably even Republican analysts and I would agree that he seems to be facing an uphill battle right now. Even if people end up, holding their nose and voting for him, whether they will donate, whether they will knock on doors, whether they will rally, I think there's an enthusiasm gap for sure. Is that something he could overcome by actually, showing a genuine shift in policy? I said this on a panel yesterday. I mean, if the Biden administration were to genuinely shift policy on Gaza, you can't make up for 30,000 people being dead in 6 months of the horror show that they have given cover to and supplied. But they could also send a message, you won't be voting for 4 more years of that. But there seems to be no inclination to do that. And if they did, let's remember the other side is already based on things like the UN Security Council vote and some very soft things they've said about weapon, possible, thinking about Israel's performance on weapons, no consequences yet, but talking, even hinting at it, that would become a powerful weapon that would be used against them in the election. So they're clearly thinking about that. And let's be clear, this isn't the only issue on the minds of American voters. It is definitely playing a bigger role than a lot of people ever imagined it would. We've all probably had conversations with people who say, oh, Israel, Palestine, people care about it. The right wing may vote on this, but the left never does. I don't know if that's going to change this year. And if it does, the implications, not just in the White House, but in Congress. And I would just note that where you have seen some shifting in the Democratic Party and even among some Republicans in terms of language on Gaza has been in Congress. And that has to do with the way our electoral system works, where members of Congress, particularly House members, but also Senate, are accountable to a much smaller specific group of people, their constituents, and they can't afford to basically say, oh, we'll write off this and it'll work out. They're actually looking at their election numbers, and you're seeing for the past 6 months, gradually more and more degrees of pragmatism or at least compassion coming out of some members of Congress. And I expect that will continue as we get closer. And already every time we do see that, if it's from a Democrat, it becomes a weapon to be used against them in primaries or in general, or if it's a Republican, possibly being primaried themselves or being used against them. So,
Daniel, the same question. What would you expect in an election year? What could it change, or what would you expect Biden administration to do in the next 6 months? Biden campaign actually to do in the next 6 months. Do you think the scaring the voters with Trump will work for those voters who are right now reactive to Biden?
I can't put myself in those shoes. I assume that they are looking at more frequent and in-depth polling and focus group data than we have access to. I think they are telling themselves that as the election gets closer and people are on the Democrat-leaning side, and especially the cohort of people who have suggested that they might be ready to not vote or not vote at all or not vote Biden over this issue, will ultimately swing back. I imagine that is a quite risky assumption for them to be making. The lines one hears that they feel pretty good about flipping some suburban women voters in Michigan who went one way in the last election to Trump and could go the other way, that that Biden has done well with the auto workers in Detroit. And so I think they are telling themselves there is a path, not only in Michigan, but also to making up for the votes that they may lose elsewhere. I do not know the extent to which they have written off some of those votes entirely. I think the point that Lara makes, that this is not only about turnout, but about the machine that encourages others to turn out, is a very strong point. And it's one that is much harder to factor into the polling data that people will be seeing. So, they've decided to roll that dice. One thing that has confused me throughout this failed effort at a mediation in order to secure an initial phase of a ceasefire, ideally with that being the on-ramp to a permanent ceasefire, this idea of a 6-week pause to get the hostages out. And let's be very, very clear, if you want to, as I do, to see a significant cohort of those Israelis being held in Gaza come out alive, then that is the way it will happen. There is that, by the way, is the fault line inside Israel, to the extent to which one could be worked on. I have enough criticism of this administration's handling for this to be a 24-hour rather than a 1-hour webinar, but nowhere do I get more angry than in their mismatch, even within the extremely narrow confines that they dictate for themselves, the way they have mismanaged the genuine fault lines, the genuine possibility of Bibi being cornered. Somehow, what this administration has achieved, and I think it was a difficult one to pull off, but they've bloody done it, is they've done just enough to strengthen Bibi, because they've given him something to punch back against. So he is stronger now, not just because of them, but largely because of the approach the administration have taken. He is stronger politically now than he was. So they've done enough to do that, but they have not done enough to actually shift his calculation by creating a set of choices where you could play in the tensions, the cracks, the disagreements that do exist in the public, in the military, and inside the war cabinet. I think the question they're asking themselves is actually much more, have we done enough to walk this magical, narrow path where we're doing enough to win back coming to the American domestic political scene, enough to win back some of that domestic support which you were speaking to and which Lara was speaking to, without upsetting what I consider to be a largely mythical thing, which is a Jewish vote that might swing on this, and or some kind of loss of donor largesse, where again I think money is not going to be their problem. So you know, that's where I think there's been a massive failing. And what I don't get, to finish the thought, is why would you want, as the US, and this is one of the reasons that there's not a ceasefire, that there's not a deal, why would you yourselves be endorsing a 6-week ceasefire after which there is a return to the horror and to the hellscape 6 weeks closer to the election? I mean, if you're thinking in those domestic political terms, and if somehow you got a deal, you should be the ones not negotiating with Israel the terms for how you massacre people in Rafah, but you should be putting your thumb down on the scales of this being the on-ramp to the permanent ceasefire. And by not doing that, I think they have made the likelihood of any kind of ceasefire that much more difficult to achieve. So, you know, all I would say is, as I noted, I hope that those who have set out a clear position of not being willing to vote in this election could come back to being willing to vote if the right policies are undertaken. But to do that, a bit of name calling and a wink and a nudge that, hey, we're really not happy with Bibi, isn't what it will take. By the way, personalizing this around Bibi is another piece of wishful thinking and dumb policy. Bibi is a particular problem, the Israeli Prime Minister, but if you think it's all plain sailing once Bibi has left the arena, then you're really not paying attention.
Thank you, Daniel. You just end your remarks with Bibi, and I just want to ask you a follow-up. Do you expect a potential, I don't want to call it interference, but Netanyahu's involvement to US election as the time approaches to November, as he did in 2012? And what would be the outcome of it?
I'm not sure. He feels the need to be as assertive and as transparent, and I'm not sure that that in this environment where he is very insistent and keen and politically needs to continue a war, and let's be very clear about something, he cannot do that without continued supply of American weaponry. He has an administration that has, done all these circuitous, non-transparent, unaccountable ways of managing to keep that weapons flow going to Israel. Let no one have any doubt. If you want to see an end to the killing in Gaza, if you want to see a ceasefire, and if you want to see those hostages out, and to get Israel to agree to a deal, the thing you put on the table is the supply of weapons. Given that issue, and given that the Biden administration, in many respects, offers better cover to Israeli egregious actions of this order of magnitude, it's more credible having the Biden administration, I think, dismissing the International Court of Justice than an alternative. Given all of that, I don't think that Netanyahu will feel the need to weigh in, which doesn't mean that if the other side, as we have seen in recent days, if the Republican side seeks to make political weather with any sense of clear blue water between Biden and Netanyahu, that Netanyahu is going to go out of his way to support the Biden administration either. But I don't think he has to do more to actively undermine them. There's a sporting expression: if the other team is scoring an own goal, don't interfere.
Yeah. Kadir, how about you?
Thank you.
In
Well,
regards to domestic politics.
Yes. I think at the beginning of right after October 7th, Biden decided to give that big bear hug to Netanyahu. And then I thought at the time I wrote that he would use that to kind of limit the, let's say, quote unquote, excesses of the, impending operations, and perhaps try to guide him or push him towards towards a position where it would benefit the U.S. foreign policy. But he didn't do that. He really undermined his legacy from Afghanistan. People thought, okay, it was a big mess, but Biden did what he believed. He took a position. He took the political cost, whatever. Not a great comparison, but in the sense that he was promising that America is back. We are going to lead internationally. We're going to do things different. He got an opportunity with Ukraine. He said, okay, the West, we are going to fight back against Russia. We are going to bring together democratic allies. And then we will march forward, and we are warning China, don't even dare in Taiwan, etc. So, but when October 7 happened, he undermined every bit of that claim to leadership, claim to do, confronting anti-democratic or undemocratic, leaders around the world, etc. And I think the establishment here, Washington, decided to kind of make sure that it didn't turn into a regional war. So they wanted to reassure Iran. There was an escalation for a while. Okay, keep that. And then don't mess with Lebanon. I mean, Netanyahu appeared like he wanted to enlarge that war into the region to, Hezbollah, Iran. When would be the next best time? This was the perfect time to actually go after Hezbollah by his calculation. So I think the Biden administration limited themselves to kind of containing the conflict, quote unquote. But what was happening on the ground, obviously there was a big outrage, and the ceasefire demand came from bottom up. It didn't. And even today, they don't quite endorse the ceasefire demand, right? The administration is not really saying, okay, now we demand a ceasefire. It's more like what Daniel said, few weeks, wouldn't it be better for you to have a pause, etc. So that has created a lot of damage. I think among the voters, this won't be repairable that easily, because as I described it just went against everything Biden has claimed. Trump was an authoritarian leader. He was coming to save democracy. He was coming to sort of give the nation a new sort of bring back the decency that the nation needed, etc. Every bit of those ideas have been demolished in this war. And then even today, not taking a clear position, not redefining a policy on Israel is going to hurt him at the ballot box. And we saw that. And we actually saw the most concrete steps he's taken was after the nomination process, when he actually saw the votes. The uncommitted votes were so large. I mean, 100,000 in Michigan, at least I would say 50 to 70,000 net was Palestine, right? I'm speculating at the end of the day, but it was a big number, because traditional uncommitted numbers were 15 to 20,000 in Michigan. So I think it will hurt him electorally. He's going to have to do a lot more to bring back some of the votes he's losing. He's not losing them to Trump necessarily, but people won't go to the ballot box probably. But some of that I think is gone. They're just not gonna show up. Of course, does it matter? It's gonna matter in the key states, the swing states. Some of these young population, African American, Black population is more in city centers. It may not matter in the swing states, etc. But I think overall we are going to see an increase in lack of enthusiasm for Biden, not just because he's old, but he's shown that in the Israel's case, he showed that he was just old-minded, let's say, from a different era. And I think his voters, is especially young, active, enthusiastic voters, are of a different mind today, and he's not gelling with them. And I don't think he can bring them back that easily. He's gonna have to do a lot more.
Thank you, Kadir. And I got some questions as direct message from social media, and all of them are on foreign policy. So I would move to foreign policy part. And do you, Laura, let's start with you. Do you expect any policy change in the Biden administration's or US foreign policy towards the region after this war? Can you also maybe give your opinions about a potential Iran deal for the future?
Sure. So first of all, the term "after this war" is hard for me to contend with. This war is still going on. It has no end in sight. And when it ends, what that will mean is Israel has decided that for now it has accomplished what it wants to accomplish, because there's no limitations that are being placed on it by anyone. And let's be clear, while what's happening in the Gaza Strip continues, and maybe that will come to some sort of definitive end when Israel declares that it's finished, whether there's any Palestinians left in Gaza at that point is a genuine open question. In the meantime, we have a ratcheting up of pressure in the West Bank. No one would call it a war yet, but there's certainly ongoing ethnic cleansing of individual communities in the West Bank, and an absolute the ramping up of pressure and violence against Palestinians there. I think it's far too soon to declare that there's not going to be a northern front. I think there is a large portion of the Israeli defense intelligentsia and political folks who are really eager to see Israel do in parts of Lebanon what it's done in Gaza. If the argument is we cannot let our communities go back home in the north until we have effectively routed Hezbollah for however many miles from the border, we're setting up for the next war. And I'm not sure I agree that the one thing I think I may be a little more negative than Kadir on this is the role of the Biden administration in somehow putting some brakes on what Israel's aspirations are and what it's doing. I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen really any brakes. If they're saying don't escalate, if Israel's not escalating in Lebanon beyond, I mean, it's clearly escalating every day right now. I don't think that's because the Biden administration is asking them not to. I think it's because they've made a decision for now not to. Bibi is very clear he is not deferential to this administration. So I guess the term "after this war" is I think it's an oversimplification of what the future by any objective analysis looks like. This is not like there's going to be everyone coming to the table, signing, and now we move forward. In terms of expecting this administration to do something different, as somebody, again, this is not a partisan thing, as someone who cares about the Middle East and cares about Palestinian lives and lives of everybody on the ground, I sure hope they do something different. I would say that hope is fine, and people in the streets, I think the amount of pressure we're seeing is unprecedented in terms of a grassroots message to politicians that there may be a cost if they don't change course. But I've heard nothing from this administration in terms of what they're saying publicly or what I'm told they're saying privately that suggests that they are intending to change course. That can change. I don't know, but they seem, from what they're saying publicly, including yesterday when they slammed the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine questions or human rights in Palestine, they slammed her basically as an anti-Semite because they didn't challenge a single thing in her latest report. This is Francesca Albanese. They said that they reject her rapporteur position, and they said that she's an anti-Semite or they're guilty of anti-Semitism, which, I mean, it's really, it almost feels like there's a almost gratuitous, like a knee-jerk reaction, which just keeps adding more fuel to the fire, as opposed to a let's step back and at least try to sound more conciliatory. Even if we're not prepared to start limiting arms or anything else, let's try to cast a position to the world that makes us sound like we're not completely oblivious to what's happening. And they seem unable or unwilling to do that. So I'm not really optimistic about that. Beyond, I mean, looking at an Iran deal, I mean, this administration, I know there's reports of recent contacts with Iran, and I guess that's good in terms of maybe preventing things from blowing up or whatever. The only policy in the Middle East this administration has shown any enthusiasm for since they took office was the Abraham Accords. And let's be clear, that's the only thing they've actually seen as like a positive thing they wanted to get, which is a Trump administration policy. So whenever there's any, before this war, before October 7th, when there was progress, Republicans said, see, it's another victory for Trump. I mean, that was the safe lane they wanted to swim in. I don't see that right now, going forward with this war, there is any opportunity for progress on the Abraham Accords. I could be wrong. That seems unlikely. They had no appetite for trying to get back to the JCPOA or something along the lines of an Iran nuclear deal before the October war. I don't think they have the war that started in October. I don't see that somehow changing. They don't seem to want to spend any political capital in the Middle East at all. Right? The Abraham Accords was a safe place to land because it's bipartisan, and if people don't like it, they can blame Trump, and Israel's on board, so it's good for Israel, and no one can get mad at them. I don't see that formula for them having changed. I hope it does.
Thank you, Lara. Daniel, the same question.
And
potential foreign policy implications.
Sure.
Maybe a geopolitical vortex that it can create now in the region.
Sure, and I'll happily pick up the baton from Lara, as I have been pleased to do throughout, because she is someone who I consider to be one of the most astute and detailed observers of everything that we are discussing. And that's why I think it's so important that when we've had a conversation about the post-October 7th policy, we ground it in the problem was the pre-October 7th policy of the Biden administration. And as Lara said, not only was that policy offering us nothing encouraging, but I think it's not unfair in hindsight. I understand that it's in hindsight, but I think it's not unfair to attribute at least some of the backdrop to October 7th to the policies of the Biden administration, because more than in the past, I'm not suggesting there was a golden era and then the Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich government came along and everything went to hell in a handbasket. No, this is a trajectory that we have been on, but there's a difference when you have an Israeli government which wears as a badge of pride, we are extremist, eradicationists, displacement, apartheidists. This is the government which the Biden administration normalized. They gave this government something that Israeli governments for generations have asked for, which is the visa waiver. That was how they created an even more promiscuous environment for their extremism. And I do contend that that extremism was an important part of the backdrop to October 7th. And by the way, an important part of the hubris and arrogance which led to Israel's not only intelligence and deterrent failure, but its first response failure on October 7th, which fed into the extent of the catastrophe that befell Israelis on that day. Palestinian elections, April 2021. they took a pass on those elections. If anything, they lined up behind the cancellation of those elections. And I would just put it to people, one of many what ifs that we will never know the answer to. But what if there had been an election and Hamas, which by all accounts, and I think there are very credible accounts, was willing to be part of a unity government that handed over primary governance in Gaza? What if that had happened? I do think the administration was trying to kind of create a Pax Americana with minimal America in the region as part of its current geopolitical balancing, Ukraine, Russia, China, and therefore thicken, pad out, and especially bring Saudi into a normalization process. I think that was primarily to do with US-Saudi and US geopolitical positioning, but they wanted to sweeten the pot domestically in the US by putting Israel into the mix. Let's never desist from reminding ourselves of the Jake Sullivan article, the print version in Foreign Affairs rather than the reworded version online, in which the National Security Advisor told us that these are the most peaceful times in the Middle East. And that was their narrative. In the days preceding October 7th, what they had to say on the so-called Palestine question was, let's not deal with Palestinians. Yes, you could have an occasional article by a jovial chap who I highly recommend no one ever bothers reading, called Tom Friedman, telling us how you can get from Saudi normalization to two states and how you can replace Benjamin Netanyahu. He's never managed to get anything right, so why should he get this right? But what they were dealing with pre-October 7th, they were telling us, look at what we just achieved at the G20 in New Delhi, on the sidelines of the G20. We signed the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. And then Bibi Netanyahu, a few days later at the UN General Assembly, showed the map. Here you have the Gulf, Israel through to Europe. It's all Israel. There's no Palestinian territories there, from the river to the sea. They were telling us, look out for I2U2. This is the story of the future. Israel, India, UAE, USA. And here we are. Because their policy has been an abomination from beginning to end, and that predated October 7th, and it has continued since October 7th. And Lara is absolutely right to point out to us that while we focus on Gaza, we should not forget what is going on in the West Bank. We should not forget what is going on in East Jerusalem. By the way, things aren't exactly great for the Palestinian citizens inside Israel, and the kind of intimidation they face. The idea, by the way, that you target the settlers only, and you play into this myth, because this is the one thing the administration has now done. It has taken measures against the settlers. I'd rather that than nothing, but I dismiss this myth that the problem is a few bad apples. It's these rotten settler types. They don't exist without the state that stands behind them, that confiscates the land for them, that provides the infrastructure for them, that arms them. And as Lara said, let's not take our eyes off of the ongoing escalation and genuine concern. And this is where I think Kadir is right. They would claim their great achievement is there has not been a regional war and a war between Israel and Hezbollah, but we are not in the clear yet. Last thing I would say is if we are going to have a serious effort, whenever the day after comes, and I share Lara's fear that this is not a day that is imminently on the horizon, if there's going to be something serious, then we must not go along with the administration in their attempt to impose an illegitimate, unelected Palestinian leadership that will continue to do their bidding and go back to a peace process, which is actually an effort in refreezing what has been accurately legally described as the apartheid reality. We have to have a totally different approach. We need a comprehensive effort in the region. That means bringing in the spoilers, whether those spoilers are Israel or whether those spoilers are Iran and the axis of resistance. And let's also be clear that this is not just America's responsibility. The US could not be doing this if we did not have the states in the region who should do better and know better, acting and largely remaining silent other than rhetorically in the face of what we see. And I was unaware of the criticism of Francesca Albanese's report, but it's an opportunity to recommend to everyone to read Anatomy of a Genocide, which was presented in Geneva by Special Rapporteur Albanese earlier this week.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I think, Lara, it was the spokesperson for the State Department making that statement, as far as I recall.
Yes, it was.
Kadir, we have 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes to answer the question, because we are sure. I know we have so many questions, but I hope we can bring Lara and Daniel together again for another panel to answer all those questions.
Well, Daniel is so articulate and passionate that it's hard to speak after him. Next time we should have a different lineup. But I really appreciate his perspective. I think he's completely on point. And just wanted to say, when I mentioned that regional confrontation, being able to kind of contain it in Palestine, I didn't mean that it was sort of Israeli, it was a success on the part of the White House, but it was these actors also, Iran, Hezbollah, they've been careful to manage this process in a certain way. So we can go into that in a different panel probably, but the administration wanted to forget about this all along. You guys both described that process, right? Just have some sort of appearance of a negotiation with Iran on nuclear issue, and then Middle East just stay where it is. And then the narrative was, like Daniel described, Israel said, if we can get the agreement with Saudi, if you normalize with Saudi, this is over. We just have a conflict management issue in Palestine. Things will happen, and we will be able to just take care of them. Don't worry about it. Just we will normalize with Saudi. But this narrative apparently was not just a narrative, but it was a narrative that was believed by Washington as well, like Daniel said. So once you start believing in your own narrative, then you have these problems. And Lara, a couple of years ago, we did the Jerusalem event when Trump declared Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. She kept saying, like, this is not gonna just go on like that. You can't just make these moves, make these major announcements, and expect that nothing will happen. So, and her crystal ball was right on that front. You can't just, continue with what is obviously an apartheid situation and all of that, and then expect that nothing will happen. And that's what happened with October 7th. But we've found that Biden administration was totally ill-prepared, and it had believed its own narrative about largely that this issue was over and we didn't have to do anything about it. And now we are at a place they have to, I mean, they don't have to, of course, but they would have to do heck of a lot more than they have been doing and reverse the American policy in fundamental ways to have any kind of serious credibility and serious impact. And it's just not going to go away. That's clear from the past 6 months, which is simply an outgrowth of decades old policy.
Thank you, Kadir. And I want to thank Lara, I want to thank Daniel and Kadir for this great discussion. And I want to thank for the attendees and for those questions. And I apologize that I couldn't direct all of those questions, but I hope to see you again. Thanks again. Have a good weekend, good evening, good night, wherever you are around.